Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. We are going to unpack Chapter 18 of Howard Zinn's landmark book, A People's History of the United States. We're looking specifically at his unique, incredibly detailed analysis of the Vietnam War. So, whether you're a major history buff or you're just curious about the raw mechanics of power and protest, Zinn's perspective offers a truly captivating lens. Let's just jump right in.
It all kicks off with this massive, glaring paradox that Zinn puts right at the forefront. Think about it. How did the United States, a superpower armed to the teeth with literally everything short of atomic bombs, fail to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny agricultural country? It's really one of the defining historical puzzles of the 20th century. And Zinn's answer? Well, it isn't about traditional military strategy. It's about the fundamental nature of the forces at play.
To figure this out, we'll follow a clear agenda today. We're going to look at 1. An impossible defeat. 2. Origins of the conflict. 3. Escalation and devastation. 4. The anti-war movement. 5. Resistance in the ranks. And finally, 6. A two-front defeat.
Starting with Section 1, an impossible defeat.
Before we hit the battlefield, we really need to understand where the author is coming from. If you're familiar with Zinn's work, you know he deliberately flips the traditional historical script. He absolutely refuses to tell the story from the top down, the usual perspective of political leaders or official state narratives. Instead, he looks at history from the bottom up. He focuses on the marginalized groups, the working class, and the grassroots popular movements. So as we go through this, keep in mind we're viewing the Vietnam War through the eyes of the people on the ground, both in Vietnam and back home in the U.S.
Zinn actually distills his entire thesis for this chapter into one incredibly powerful dynamic. He writes that this war was a clash of organized modern technology versus organized human beings. And the crucial takeaway? The human beings won. Zinn argues that despite the unprecedented technological and financial dominance of the U.S. military, the sheer willpower, organization, and resilience of the people just couldn't be bombed into submission.
Moving on to Section 2, origins of the conflict.
So, the big thing to understand here is that U.S. involvement didn't just magically begin with troop surges in the 1960s. Back in 1945, after Japan left Indochina, Ho Chi Minh led a revolutionary movement and declared independence. And get this, between 1945 and 1946, he actually wrote 8 separate letters to U.S. President Harry Truman asking for support. He was leading on American promises of self-determination, but according to the text, Truman never replied. Instead, when the French came back to reclaim their colony, which kicked off an 8-year war, the U.S. stepped in to back France. By 1954, the U.S. was bankrolling 80% of the French war effort, pouring in $1 billion and 300,000 weapons.
And this brings us to a really striking piece of historical irony that Zinn points out. Back in 1945, when Ho Chi Minh drafted Vietnam's Declaration of Independence, he didn't just cite communist literature. He literally borrowed phrases directly from the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. The Vietnamese document championed the exact same idea, that all men are created equal, endowed with rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Zinn uses this to highlight a massive disconnect between America's founding ideals and the reality of its Cold War foreign policy.
Okay, Section 3, escalation and devastation.
The major turning point for direct American involvement was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The official story, pushed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, was that American destroyers on a routine patrol suffered an unprovoked torpedo attack by North Vietnam. But Zinn pulls from the Pentagon Papers, that famously leaked top-secret government study, to argue that this official narrative was completely fabricated. The reality? The U.S. destroyer Maddox was actually on a covert electronic spy mission in Vietnamese waters, alongside CIA secret operations against coastal targets. Zinn argues this fake episode was deliberately used to deceive the public and greenlight a full-scale war.
Once that full-scale war was underway, the human cost was just unimaginable. Zinn outlines the brutal reality of on-the-ground tactics like search-and-destroy missions and what the military called free-fire zones. In these designated zones, military command essentially decided that anyone left, civilians, the elderly, little kids, was automatically the enemy. Bombs were just dropped at will. Zinn specifically references the total obliteration of villages like Ben Suk to drive home the point that this wasn't just a war against an opposing army, it was effectively a war waged against the civilian population.
And the sheer scale of the devastation didn't even stop at Vietnam's borders. Let's look at this number. 75,000. Zinn cites author Fred Brandman to expose a largely hidden part of the conflict. Over 75,000 tons of bombs were dropped by the U.S. on the Plain of Jars in neighboring Laos. Laos wasn't even officially at war with the U.S., yet the bombing campaign completely leveled the entire above-ground society there. Zinn uses this to illustrate just how vast and unchecked the military expansion had become.
Which leads us to Section 4, the anti-war movement.
So as the war escalated, so did the domestic backlash. Now there's this really persistent myth that the anti-war movement was basically just a bunch of privileged college students. Zinn completely dismantles that. He shows us that the resistance was actually this incredibly diverse coalition. He highlights early pushback from civil rights groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He also points to surveys revealing that working-class citizens, including poor black and white communities in the South, fiercely opposed the war. They were constantly asking, why are our high taxes going overseas to kill people when there's so much poverty right here at home?
This sentiment was captured beautifully and powerfully by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Zinn highlights King's bold choice to publicly connect the civil rights struggle in America directly to the anti-war movement. King fiercely condemned the destruction of lives and culture in Vietnam, pointing out that poor Americans were paying a double price, smashed hopes at home and death abroad. This global perspective of solidarity gave the anti-war cause a massive surge of moral weight.
Next up, Section 5, resistance in the ranks. Because you see, the protests didn't stay confined to civilians. According to Zinn, the resistance started taking root among the soldiers themselves. It began with these isolated, unbelievably brave acts. Like in 1965, Richard Stink, a West Point graduate, flat out refused to board a plane for a remote Vietnamese village, saying the war wasn't worth a single American life. In 1966, 3 Army privates from poor, diverse backgrounds famously refused deployment, calling the conflict immoral, illegal, and unjust. By early 1968, with 40,000 American soldiers dead and absolutely no victory in sight, the sheer cruelty of it all began to break down the conscience of the wider ranks, leading to an unprecedented collapse of military discipline.
Finally, Section 6, a two-front defeat.
Zinn shares a fascinating quote from New York Times correspondent C.L. Sulzberger, who was actually quite close to the government. In 1973, Sulzberger wrote that the U.S. emerged as the big loser. He famously stated that the U.S. lost the war in the Mississippi Valley, not just the Mekong Valley. The underlying point here is that the fatal blow to the entire military operation was the absolute inability of the U.S. government to maintain mass public support back home.
So pulling all of this together, Zinn presents a clear dual thesis. He argues the U.S. government was defeated on 2 totally different fronts. First, they were defeated abroad by an incredibly organized, highly motivated peasant resistance. And second, they were defeated at home by an astonishingly diverse and relentless movement of protest. Zinn really stresses this. While traditional history books love to credit politicians for ending wars, in Vietnam, the political leaders, like Johnson and Nixon, were actually the very last ones to take steps to end the conflict. They were effectively forced to stop the escalation by the sheer, undeniable pressure of the people.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to chew on based on Zinn's analysis. If the end of this historically massive war was genuinely driven by organized human beings, everyday citizens, dissenting soldiers, and determined peasants, rather than the brilliant strategy of political leaders, well, what role does the voice of the people truly play in changing the course of modern history right now? It's a powerful framework for looking at our past, and honestly, an even more powerful one for looking at our present. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.